But today we are beginning to look at Christ's prophecy of his second advent, or his second coming, as we continue in Matthew chapter 24 in the prophecy of the end, and where, if we recall, Jesus has just been in the temple courts. He's been arguing and debating with the religious elites all day long. And finally, as they are leaving, the disciples are awed by the majesty of the great buildings of the temple, and Jesus informs them that it's all going to be destroyed. And so, when they have gone to the Mount of Olives, and they're in private, probably in the Garden of Gethsemane, the disciples now come to him and ask him what he means by that, and when will that happen, and when is the sign of his coming. And that question they ask is in verse 3, and if we look back there, it's two questions, as we said last week. They ask, when will these things be, meaning when will the destruction you're talking about, when will that happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, they might have meant that all as one question, but with the benefit of hindsight, as we read this passage, we see that really as two questions. That, as we talked about last week, there are examples in Scripture of what is known as a double prophecy or a double fulfillment. And we took some time last week to look at the prophecy of Emmanuel, born of a virgin. And we saw how that was fulfilled in Isaiah's fairly immediate future within the birth of his own son, Maher-shalal-Hash-baz, to whom that child is initially referring to, and then to the destruction of the northern kingdom within 60 years. But then how the New Testament says, well, that prophecy is not only about that time, it's also looking much further to the one who is truly Emmanuel, God with us, who will truly be born of a virgin. And so we're looking at that as an example and using that as a framework to help us understand what Jesus is saying here and how he is giving this prophecy. Because on the one hand, he is talking about the destruction of the temple that will happen within 40 years, because Jesus is making this prophecy around 33 AD, and the temple is destroyed by the Romans in the year 70 AD. So within 40 years of Jesus saying this, a lot of these things will be fulfilled. But at the same time, Jesus is using this as a kind of filter or a kind of foreshadowing of the great end, which is still future to us. And so we sort of have to keep both those things in a kind of balance, because it's clear at some points that Jesus is talking to his disciples. He's saying, you guys, you 11 guys, because one of you is not going to last this long, and actually a couple others aren't going to last this long, because even James the apostle died early on. He was the first apostle to die for Christ. So, but at least a bunch of you that I'm talking to right here and now are going to experience what I'm talking about when the temple is destroyed. Even Peter would have been martyred before the temple was destroyed. But at least a few of them would actually see this happen. And so he's talking to them then. For example, I'll just pull this out, for example, to illustrate the point. In verse 20, he says, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath. Well, that specifically applies to the disciples in their experience of what is going to be happening. Because the Sabbath day, Saturday, would be much more understandable to them. That normally, as Torah-keeping Jews, we can only go a certain amount of steps, certain length of journey on the Sabbath. And so we just pray that when we have to escape these terrible things, it won't happen on the Sabbath, so that we can really get away far. Whereas beyond the cross, into the church age, into the later history, then the idea of traveling on the Sabbath is no longer, does not at least have the force as it would here. So that's just a reminder that Jesus is talking specifically to the disciples of what they will experience. That's on the one hand, but then as Jesus is talking, it also sort of dissolves into the great end at the same time. And so, they're weaved together, so it's quite difficult to try to extricate them. But we will do our best, because the experience of what the disciples will go through in all the suffering leading up to the Romans coming and destroying everything in the land of Judah in their lifetimes is meant to be a little taste of what will ultimately happen, Jesus is saying, before he returns and before he comes back. And so let's just read this passage together. Let's read verse 15 until verse 31.
So, when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and miracles to deceive even the elect, if that were possible. See, I have told you ahead of time. So, if anyone tells you, "There he is out in the desert," do not go out. Or, "Here he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will mourn. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other.
So we even see in that section how it begins talking about what the disciples will experience in their own lifetime, and then it fades into the far distance, into the coming of the Son of Man and the glorious day that will be. And so if we go back to verse 15 and go through this passage, we see that it first talks about the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place. And then there's a little, your Bible might have parentheses or brackets, and then mine says, "Let the reader understand." And that's Matthew writing there, and because he's recording Jesus' words, but this is Matthew breaking in and saying, "Hey guys, pay attention to this. Make sure you understand what Jesus is talking about here." So there's an extra little encouragement for us to understand what verse 15 is talking about. And it's fairly complicated, because the prophet Daniel, in Daniel chapter 11, refers to an evil king who will come, and he will set up an abomination of desolation. in the temple, which is the holy place. And so why don't we go there, rather than me just telling you about it. Let's just flip in our Bibles to the book of Daniel. If you find Ezekiel, then Daniel's the next one. Daniel's the next book there.
What chapter?
Chapter 11. So the second last chapter of Daniel. And we'll just look at verse 29. And this will help us a little bit begin to understand what Jesus is talking about. So Daniel chapter 11 is a long chapter as well, so we're already just jumping in towards the end. And so in Daniel 11 verse 29, it says, "At the time appointed he shall return and come into the south." Now I'll just let you know that Daniel is talking about a king here. He's talking about a king who is reigning north of Israel. And so at the appointed time, this northern king shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. So of course, we're skipping over a lot of context here. So he's a northern king, and it says he will come into the south. The reference point is Israel in the middle. So he's saying it's a northern king of Israel coming to an area south of Israel. Well, if anyone can think of geography, what big important nation is south of Israel? Egypt. That's right. So it's talking about a northern king coming to Egypt. But it shall not be this time as it was before. So he's done this before, but this is a different experience. Verse 30, "For ships of Kittim shall come against him." Kittim is ancient Italy that's being referred to here. So ships of Italy shall come against him, this northern king, and he shall be afraid of these soldiers from Italy, from ancient Italy, and will withdraw and shall turn back. And he is enraged, my version says. He is spitting mad because these foreign ships have come and prevented him from fighting Egypt. So he's really mad as now he's going home. And now as he goes home north, where is he going to end up in on his way?
Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem, in Israel, that's right. So he's really mad, and so he decides to take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Forces from him, so soldiers, shall appear and profane the temple and the fortress. Because right beside the temple was built a very large fortress called the Acra. And whoever controls the fortress controls the temple and controls Jerusalem. But he's going to profane the temple. And here it is, "He shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action." And if we just skip down to verse 36, "And the king shall do as he wills. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and he shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done." So we get a little insight into this king's ego and what he thinks of himself. So the whole idea, he's going to come and try to attack Egypt. These ships from ancient Italy are going to stop him. He's going to be really mad about that. And as he comes back through Israel, he's going to say, "I've had it with these Jewish people and their crazy beliefs. So now they have to believe what everybody else has to believe. I'm going to make sure that they do." And he puts a stop to the sacrifices. Imagine how crazy the Jews are going to do that if you stop the temple sacrifices. And he says, he sets up an abomination that makes desolate. So I think if we break that down, An abomination, according to the Old Testament, is something that is absolutely disgusting in the eyes of God. Okay, to use Old Testament language, it's a stench in God's nostrils. That's what an abomination is. So this king sets up something that is absolutely disgusting and heinous in the holy place, in the temple. And this disgusting, abominable thing causes desolation, which means all the priests run away, and all the people who love God run away, because the temple has been destroyed. The temple is now empty and desolate, because now it's under the control of this foreign king. All right. Daniel is writing this prophecy somewhere around the year 570, 560, probably 550, because he's in Babylon. So around 550, let's say. 300 years after Daniel writes these words, these things actually happen. There's a Greek king in the land of Syria, which is north of Israel. He calls himself Antiochus Epiphanes. He gives himself the nickname Epiphanes. Epiphanes means, look at me, I'm a god. So he calls himself, look at me, I'm a god, as his nickname. So he thinks very well of himself. He decides that he wants to come and attack Egypt. At this time, Israel is under his control. So he comes down, he wants to attack Egypt, but just at this time, the Romans are entering the world scene, and they come to Egypt, and they tell this king, you can't attack Egypt. The Roman general at this time is so arrogant that he draws a circle in the sand around the king, and he says to the king, who thinks of himself as God, he tells him, you can't leave this circle that I've just drawn around you, or you will have all the power of Rome coming down upon your head.
Wow.
This makes Antigonus Epiphanes extremely angry, because, of course, as kings do, they want to do what they want to do, and now the Romans have spoiled his party. So in a temper tantrum, he goes back up through Jerusalem, through Israel, and he's so mad he's had it with these Jews. So he takes out all his anger upon the Jewish people, and he starts a program and a policy that all Jews have to act like Greeks now. They can't get circumcised anymore. They can't worship their own gods. They have to worship all the other gods. They have to join gymnasiums and be naked as they exercise and all. They have to take Greek culture and speak Greek and all this. You can imagine this doesn't go over very well. But in order to make them really mad, he enters the temple courts, and in the temple courts, he sacrifices a pig and puts it on a stick in the temple. And that is the abomination that causes desolation. And so that is so disgusting in the eyes of the people that the temple itself has been defiled. They all run away and desert the temple courts, because this is a stench in God's eyes, in his nostrils. And so what happens, of course, as I said, this doesn't go over very well. Some Jews, they just start to conform and do what the king tells them to. But other Jews, called the family of the Maccabees, they start a revolt. And from that revolt, ultimately, they actually push the Greek army under Antiochus Epiphanes out of Israel, and they actually restore the land of Israel to themselves. And then eventually they set themselves up as the high priest, and ultimately as the king. And so for a short time of about 100 years, Israel is free. For about 100 years, under their own kings, the descendants of these Maccabees, these freedom fighters who fought to free them from the control of this king. They restore the temple, they cleanse it, they restore everything is back to normal. And then around AD 60, the Romans finally come to Israel, and they look around and they say, I think we'll take this over too. And so they do. And that's 60 years before Christ is born. So all of this that Daniel has predicted has actually happened in Jesus' past, in Jesus' history. And yet, at the same time, just like Jesus' prophecy, Daniel is also prophesying towards the final end, even though these things have been fulfilled. And so, if you imagine standing at a lake and tossing a flat stone across the surface, what does it do? It skips several times, right? And so we can see this prophecy skipping through history. So Daniel, it's like Daniel tosses the stone, it skips once in this time that I've just talked about, in talking about these things of the first abomination that causes desolation, and then it gets to Jesus' time, and Jesus says it's going to happen again soon when the Romans come to destroy the temple, because when they come, all sorts of desolations are going to happen to the temple. But then it's also going to skip to the far future. All right. I hope that has been clear enough. So Jesus is saying that when the end comes, both in the disciples' own lifetime with the coming of the Romans, but also in the time of the final end, there will be an abomination that causes desolation. This is a great time of tribulation against the people of God. So he says then in verse 16, "Then when this is happening, let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." He's talking about his followers here. So that if they are still stuck in the land of Judea when the Romans are rolling in, Jesus is saying, make sure you guys get out of there. So flee to the mountains, flee away from the city. Then he says in verses 17 and 18 that it's such a trying time that you won't even have time to go get your stuff. So he says, if you're on your rooftop, don't go back into your house to grab your purse. Run down the steps and get out of there. Or if you're working in the field, don't go back to the edge of the field to get your coat. No, just run. So these images are meant to show how swift this destruction will be coming when the Romans come in, and that they have to get out of there fast.
Can I just throw something into the
Sure.
a little bit, but I'll be nice.
Okay.
Yeah. So your interpretation would be that the abomination that causes desolation that Jesus is talking about is when the Romans come in 70 AD, or would you say that's also future? So you've got the one that happened with Daniel's prophecy, and then the prophecy of Jesus. Would there be three? Is that what you're saying? Or are you saying the abomination here is with the Romans coming in?
So that is
Because
a good question.
Because of course, some people would say, no, it's all future. It's when the Antichrist rises to power, and there's that.
So what I'm attempting to say is that yes, there's one for the Romans, but that's also foreshadowing another one in the future, because 2 Thessalonians clearly talks about the man of lawlessness, and that's talking about the future as well, even though that can even be talking about that present time as well. But what I want to be careful about is that we don't necessarily take all the details forward. Because there are some people who take this and say, well, there has to be a desolation, abomination desolation in the holy place. Well, today there's no holy place. So we need to get the Muslims out of Jerusalem so that we can build a holy place so that this can happen. And I think that's taking things too far. So I think what Jesus is saying is, yes, there will be some kind of abomination of desolation, but it won't necessarily be a carbon copy of all the ones that have been seen. So whether there's a temple in the future that gets rebuilt and this happens or not, it's a very complicated issue. But that there will be some kind of testing of God's people with some kind of bombshell that is reminiscent of the former abominations. Does that,
Good. Oh, yeah.
at least does that
Sure.
answer make sense? A little bit? Okay.
Sorry to throw you off.
Yeah, that's okay. I'll get back to where I was going. That is a good point, because I think a lot of the details are fulfilled in the coming of Rome to destroy Jerusalem, but it's not necessary that we will see all those details again in the final end, but there will still be a correspondence between them. And so I think we should guard ourselves against trying to find all the little details and say, oh, they're being fulfilled in our day. Well, they may or they may not. But what Jesus is talking about in terms of the immediate prophecy is a kind of foreshadowing of what will happen in the end. So he continues in verse 19 to emphasize how bad this will be. It'll be so bad that it's not going to go well for pregnant women or with newborn babies. And as we looked at already, he says also pray that your flight may not take place in winter, when it would be much harder to flee. Israel doesn't get a whole lot of snow, but it is colder in the winter months, and so that would be a lot harder to escape, or on a Sabbath when they are restricted from as much travel. So all of these things is to emphasize how fast this is going to happen and how terrible it's going to be. And that's what verse 21 then says. Then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And so here again, there's a kind of double sense here that shows that when the Romans came, it was absolutely terrible what they did. I think I mentioned the Jewish historian Josephus, and he describes in painstaking detail what the Romans did to the Jewish people, and it was not pretty at all. They starved them out, they killed them, men, women, children, they burned them out. It was just absolutely horrific suffering upon the Jewish people. And so this is a great tribulation, but again, it's giving us a foretaste of what is to come. Jesus says in verse 22, it's so bad that if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. And so God is still watching over his people, even in the midst of this great suffering and tribulation. So for the sake of the elect, he says, these days are not prolonged, but are cut short. Let's just think of that word for a moment. Jesus doesn't use the word elect very much. That's more a word used by the Apostle Paul. But what this passage shows us is that Jesus can use it. So he says in verse 22, he mentions the elect. At the end of verse 24, he mentions the elect. And then, if you noticed, verse 31, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. And so this shows us that Jesus can use that term, the elect. And what that means is God's chosen people. But what we also notice is that the elect are going through the tribulation here. They're suffering through the tribulation and through these very difficult times. But it says God is also watching over his people. This time, Jesus says here, will not just be a time of physical suffering and trauma, but it's going to be a very spiritual, dangerous time. Because in all the chaos of what is happening, there's going to be a lot of deceivers and a lot of people saying, hey, look, the Christ is over here. Or, hey, look, the anointed one, the Messiah, is over there. And he tells his disciples, don't believe it, no matter who says it. He says, for false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. Isn't that a bit of an odd way to put it? But what Jesus means here is that the signs and wonders that will be performed falsely will be so convincing. They will be so convincing that real Christians will wonder. That real Christians will say, I know I've got my Bible, but that is amazing. I've never heard or seen that. Science can't explain it. That is incredible. So could it be? Could something be happening? So even real Christians, Jesus says, the elect, begin to wonder. That's how amazing these signs and wonders are. And he warns them, verse 25, see, I have told you beforehand. So Jesus is arming them, he's arming his disciples with this knowledge so that they will not be deceived, so that they will cling tightly to Jesus' teaching, that they remember. So he continues, verse 26, so if they say to you, look, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. So he's saying, basically, clap your hands over your ears and sing la 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 when people are saying this stuff. Because I've told you beforehand, I've warned you that this is not the case. He's not going to be out somewhere in the wilderness. He's not going to be hidden in an inner room in the closet. No, Jesus says, verse 27. And here's really where the immediate prophecy of what Jesus is warning his disciples about now fades into the far thing. And this is why it's very difficult for those who would want to say, oh, all of this is fulfilled in the coming of the Romans. Because Jesus clearly says here, verse 27, he says, for as the lightning comes from the east and shines as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. And so have you ever watched sheet lightning? I used to as a kid. I loved it. I thought it was God's TV show. And I would stare out my window and I'd watch the lightning crack across the sky. And those are the thin ones. But then you get the sheet lightning that lights up all the clouds of the sky. And it's very visible. It's hard to miss that, you know. And what Jesus is saying is that when he comes back, when the Son of Man comes back, at the coming of the Son of Man, at the parousia of the Son of Man, it's going to be visible. You're not going to miss it. Just like you wouldn't miss lightning happening before your eyes, you're not going to miss the return of Christ. It's going to be visible. It's going to be glorious. It's going to be powerful.
That's why he says, if they say he's over here, don't believe it.
Yeah, don't believe it.
Over there, don't
Because when he comes, you'll know
You're
it.
gonna know it.
That's right. And then he says, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. So if you've ever been in a desert climate, and you see some vultures or birds of prey flying around, what are they usually doing?
Circling.
That's right, they're circling, right? And they're usually wide circles that get tighter and tighter and tighter. And you can see that from quite a distance. You say, oh, there's a vulture, or there's an eagle, or there's a bird of prey over there. But what does that tell you? If you see a bird circling,
Something dead.
what do you know is beneath that circle?
Yeah.
Something is dead. And that's what Jesus is saying. When you see all these things happening right before you, you know what's happening right here.
Usually the vultures too, don't they start circling because something's going to die?
That's
Not
right.
because it's dead yet.
Yeah, that's
So-
right. That's right.
But it's
Yeah, if
imminent.
it's dead, they'll actually swoop down and
Yeah, but
and
it's
see it,
imminent
yeah.
when you see that circling going
Yeah,
on.
yeah,
So you see these kind of things happening, it's getting imminent.
yeah, yeah. Be aware. Have your antenna up. That's right.
Just on a, I think a humorous note, on verse 27, back in the 90s, I heard an evangelical talking about CNN and global television and that, and saying, this is the first time in history that the coming of Christ could actually be seen around the world. Because if you're on one side of the globe, you can't see it on the other. But now with CNN, you can.
Oh,
Oh my goodness. Cannot the God who made the eye make people all around the globe
That's
see?
right. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
And look how
And
many
then-
vultures there are now.
What's that?
Look how many vultures.
Oh, there you go, yes.
When I grew up, there weren't any vultures.
Oh, really?
No, there weren't any.
Yeah,
I used to do a lot of hunting and stuff like that. I saw one. I
yeah,
didn't know what it was. But now you can almost look up in the sky everywhere and see a vulture.
yeah, yeah.
And I always say that's, I hope they don't eat me.
Well, that's always if you're out hiking and you're a little thirsty and you're walking a little slower and you see one, you know what it thinks. And you're like, okay, this guy's not gonna make it. Yeah. So these are all things to show that Jesus' coming will be clear and obvious and visible. There won't be any mistake. There won't be any wondering, oh, did Jesus come back? Did he not come back yet? No, it will be obvious and clear.
What's interesting in 2 Peter, he talks about clearly the Lord coming in glory. It's the second coming, but he talks about it being like a thief in the night.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always found that really interesting because people often compare that with the idea of a separate rapture.
Mm-hmm.
The rapture is secret. It is like a thief in the night. But this is going to be like a thief in the night as well. It's sudden. When you're not expecting, it's going to happen.
And that's really what the next part, and it doesn't look like we'll get there today, but that's what's emphasized, the suddenness of it. It compares it with Noah, the suddenness of the flood coming and sweeping them all away. And so that's when readiness and when readiness is emphasized. So like verse 44, you must be ready for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So there's that suddenness right there. Well, let's just finish off what we had read, because now Jesus really gets into the great cosmic picture of what will happen. So he says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. So these are all pictures of great cosmic shaking here. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn. Why will they mourn? Because they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And so, why would the tribes of the earth mourn to see Jesus coming back? Why would that be a mournful moment?
Because the gig's up.
Yeah, the gig is up, and now they know it. Because if Jesus is coming, he's coming in judgment. And there it says, verse 31, and he, the Son of Man, that's Jesus, will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other. And so this is the gathering that Jesus talks about. And we'll talk a little bit more about that next week, because Jesus actually tells a parable back in Matthew 13 that we can also look at for reference. But what's very interesting is that if Jesus refers to the elect, what is implied by the elect? What is the opposite of the elect?
The doomed.
That's right. That's right. The opposite of elect is non-elect. Right? When you go into the voting box and you have 4 candidates to choose from, and you elect one of them, what have you done?
Eliminated.
You have not elected 3 of them. So whenever there's elect, there's implied the non-elect or the unelect. And that's what Jesus is saying here. So the elect are gathered from all corners of the earth, from every tribe, tongue, and nation. But the non-elect are saved for judgment, and they are among those who will mourn. Because those who have longed to see Jesus, as Paul says, all those who have longed for his coming, they're not going to be mourning. We're not going to be mourning. That's going to be the greatest day ever. It's a day of salvation. It's a day of joy. It's a day where we get to see Jesus face to face in his glory. And that's why it is a day both of judgment and of salvation.